The Rebel Capitalist Show.
If you look at it from the exporter, the country that's running the trade surplus, you got to look at their end of the bargain, and that's that they get the reserve asset that is a long-dated dollar. And so we're looking at this saying, wait a minute, this isn't a very good idea because we've got a lot of counterparty risk. And they're looking at this, China specifically, and I'm referencing my discussion with Luke Broman, our good buddy. And he points out very well that China's like, okay, we're producing all this stuff because we need to buy energy in the future. But the what we're getting for producing all this stuff, which would be dollars or treasuries, we're going to be able to buy a lot less of that in the future, a lot less oil, a lot less energy, because the Fed is keeping rates, at negative, or real rates, let's say, at negative 8 or 9, 10%. Who knows what the real rate actually is? And therefore, we also have just as much counterparty risk as the United States does. It's just in a different format. We have counterparty risk in the fact that they supply us with all our stuff, and they have counterparty risk. And from a standpoint of everything they're getting for supplying that stuff, we have certain control over the purchasing power.
And that's before they went and stole Russia's reserve assets.
Exactly. Now you really realize the counterparty risk.
And so, it's not just what you hold, because part of what we're discussing there is this flow of capital, right? And you're saying, well, I kind of got to keep my business going. If it's a country, kind of keeping your business going. And you got this setup where you're investing in these treasuries, your surplus in the treasuries, keeping exports going, and so on and so forth. But now you've also got to look at it's your income statement and your balance sheet, right? So on your balance sheet, you've got all of these surplus treasuries, which just got stolen from Russia. Okay, stolen, frozen, call it what you will. Now, it is impossible for other countries to not look at that and say, do we maybe just not save as much in treasuries?
Exactly.
Even if they don't have to dishoard, they don't have to sell. All they need to do, there's about 900 billion a year that needs to go into treasuries. So from credits and nations, all they need to do is just curtail some of those purchases and put it into something else. The question then is, what is the something else? I would suggest it's gold.
Yeah, that's what Luke
I think it's, and so that whole dynamic, and then there's a feedback loop that takes place with it, right? Because as more people do it, it accelerates the trend. And look, we're at the tipping point where this is such a precarious house of cards that I'm not sure you can deleverage and de-escalate that without serious second order consequences. This is without looking at canceling what is the world's largest energy producer. You cannot cancel the world's largest energy producer and not have some serious financial repercussions to that.
And I just did a story today too on how Russia, last week they came out and said, well, okay, we're going to price some of our natural gas in rubles. But this week, just as of today, it's Wednesday today, I believe the 29th or the 30th, something like that. They came out and said that they could price all commodities. So not just natural gas, but that would include oil, that would include fertilizer, that would include timber, that would include everything else that they produce that the world really depends on for energy and food. Really the two most, you can have all the gold and Bitcoin and real estate and dollars that you want. If you don't have food and energy, you got big problems. And people say, oh, well, that's not that big of a deal because Russia supplies X amount, let's say like, 20% of the potash, but they don't realize that the price is really determined at the margin because you're dealing with very inelastic demand.
There's two things. Price is always determined at the margin, but additionally, it comes back to what we were talking about before, this highly financialized, highly globalized economy whereby everything has been outsourced and just-in-time inventory and so on and so forth. The supply chains are so important for bringing any produce to market, that even small disruptions in them can change that margin. And we're not seeing small disruptions, we're seeing extraordinarily large disruptions. So for example, so Ukraine produces 90% of the neon in the world. Neon is utilized in semiconductors. Semiconductor shortages now, which are mostly produced in Taiwan, are causing impacts in farmers in Brazil. I read it.
Because they can't get their tractors. Their tractors won't work without the semiconductors.
So you've got a farmer in Brazil that's not going to plow his crop, or he's not going to harvest his crop, or whatever the case might be. A certain amount of supply comes off the market there, as a consequence of this chain of events. So what we are going to move to by sheer necessity are more resilience, a requirement and a need for more resilience, which is going to be offshoring goes away, it becomes onshoring, but that's going to be a more painful experience for the countries that have financialized.
Right.
It'll be less, all things being equal, which they're not, but all things being equal, those countries that have not offshored to the extent that others have, that have not financialized to that extent, are in a somewhat better or more resilient position in order to move forward. And then the second step that takes place ordinarily, and you look in history, this is what we do as humans, is we build alliances, right? You go, shit, I can't do this myself. I haven't got the capabilities, but I do have what I have here. I can do X, Y, Z, and my neighbor over there can do, ABC. Let's get together. And so that happens on a macro basis. And so we're seeing a lot of that taking place. Turkey is a huge manufacturing country, but they're short in energy.
Okay. Yeah, which is why they're hyperinflating the lira.
Which is partly why they're hyperinflating the lira, apart from the fact that Erdogan is not the smartest, sort of sharpest tool in the shed, but never mind. But there's just a geopolitical reality there that they will need to source and secure energy. They're going to have to. And so even while Turkey has been looking to join the EU, largely as a consequence of many other reasons, most of which are just trying to extract more money out of them, because they've done extraordinarily well in NATO with that respect. But the reality is that's not going to happen. They know that they're not going to get the energy from Western Europe. They're not going to come from the EU, who are a net importer of energy. So there's where's the relationship? When the pressure's on, the relationship changes. And so their alliances will look elsewhere. It'll be Iran, it'll be Russia, it'll be Saudi Arabia, it'll be somewhere else. And so these sorts of alliances they're being shaped and formed now. And so back to the question at hand, which is how do you invest in this world? It's paying strong attention to that, because there is an extraordinary symmetry again in if there's no energy, say in Western Europe, and they're clamping down on it and they're trying to push, the road to zero and all this nonsense they keep talking about.
Oh yeah, to 2050 the carbon net zero thing.
Yeah. So the more they push towards that, the higher the price of the underlying asset that they're constricting goes to. And people even within those like within the EU are going to seek alternatives, because they're going to have to. What's going to be interesting, because Russia's basically, for example, said, look, we're going to turn off your gas unless you pay us in rubles. And Macron came out, I think it was yesterday, and said, no, we're not going to pay you in rubles. So, and Hungary turned around and said, yeah, we will. So what's going to be interesting is when Hungary's got energy and France doesn't, okay?
Yeah, but you know what's going to happen there is France is just going to buy their energy from Hungary.
Either that look,
it's just a workaround.
This is the beginning of the end of the EU. It cannot hold together, because what will happen is von der Leyen and all these clowns sitting in Brussels, drinking their Perrier and eating their caviar, are going to say, no, Hungary, you're not allowed to do that. And we're now putting in some legislature and blah, blah, blah. And Hungary is going to turn around and say, niet. And so then of course, they're going to do similar to what they did to Poland. And they're going to say, well, we're not going to give you the funds that we promised you in terms of our budgets and da, 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 da. Because remember, the point is, what's made the EU so successful, quote unquote successful, is the fact that they've centralized the banking to the extent where they have control over the banking in each individual country, and they provide liquidity or not to the banking systems. And so that's an extraordinary tool, and they're going to probably utilize that. But again, it's meeting these pressures of, well, freezing for one. And so I can see that just building, and it's going to fracture and bifurcate, and you're going to have certain countries that just go a certain way and other ones that don't. And in that environment, it creates more asymmetry, much, much more asymmetry than we would ever have had, like in my career. I mean, I've just never had to deal with this sort of
on that geopolitical note, people have to realize that in the West, the politicians are doing this balancing act that I think we will see more of in the future. And so when you're talking about different countries to invest or stay away from, I think you've got to think through what the incentives are for the politicians that are involved. So as an example, today, Germany announced that they would not pay for natural gas in rubles. Therefore, they're going to consider just restricting supply or rationing gasoline and rationing energy. Okay, well, we know, like we said earlier, that energy is the economy. So if you're rationing energy, then you are decreasing economic output, GDP, voluntarily. And if you're reducing GDP, you're reducing the standard of living. Bottom line, period. There's no way of getting around that. So what they're doing is, on one hand, they're trying to be woke, and they're trying to be green and ESG and all these things because they know their voters want that, or the majority of their constituents, let's say, want that. And then on the other hand, they're going to have to battle and deal with the standard of living going down further and further and further, and less economic activity. So it's like, where do they get that to that tipping point, right? And you have to understand that if you're an investor, and let's say you're considering investing in Germany right now, you've got to realize that you're putting capital to work in an area where the politicians are voluntarily choosing to be woke at the expense of lowering the standard of living and the economic output in their country. And so
they're making up the shortfall by printing stimmy checks.
Yeah, right. And for people who aren't following that, who don't really understand inflation, I can tell you this very simply, that in the solution for inflation is not more money, it is more stuff. If you try to solve an inflation problem with more money, you're just going to exacerbate the problem.